The Grand Council chamber never failed to impress, even after my 300 cycles of service. Not that I would ever admit that out loud. We Xylaxians have a reputation for being perpetually unimpressed to maintain. Today, however, the chamber's sweeping architecture and hovering platforms seem to mock the gravity of our situation. Order. Order in the council. High Councillor Prell's voice boomed through the chamber, their four-throat sacs pulsating with barely contained frustration. I watched from my elevated platform as the various representatives continued their heated arguments, completely ignoring the council leader's calls for silence. How very typical. As ambassador of the Xylaxian Concordat, I had the dubious pleasure of watching this circus unfold from my prime viewing position. The circular chamber housed representatives from over 300 species, each more convinced of their own importance than the last. The cacophony of their arguments echoed off the crystal walls, creating a symphony of political chaos that would give even a Vandorian mind monk a headache. To my left, Ambassador Thex of the militant Corax Imperium was practically foaming from all three mouths, their scaled skin turning an alarming shade of purple as they demanded immediate action. The Corax had always been quick to anger, quicker to war, and somehow even quicker to lose those wars. You'd think they'd learn after a few millennia. We cannot allow this to continue, Thex roared, pounding their ceremonial staff against the platform. The humans have gone too far. I fought the urge to roll my primary eyes. The humans had barely gone anywhere at all, if we're being honest. But try telling that to the Corax, who still hadn't gotten over how a single human trade ship had outmaneuvered their entire defense fleet last solar cycle. The fact that the human ship had been delivering medical supplies to a plague-stricken world in Corax space seemed to matter little to their wounded pride. Ambassador Yora of the Celestial Concordance floated serenely on their platform, their bioluminescent tendrils pulsing with calming patterns. Perhaps they suggested in their melodious voice we should consider peaceful dialogue. Several council members visibly recoiled at such a radical suggestion. Peace. How dare they even suggest such a thing? From my vantage point, I could see the various alliances and factions clearly displayed in the seating arrangements. The militant bloc, led by the Corax, clustered together like angry storm clouds. The Commerce Coalition huddled in their section, probably calculating how to profit from whatever decision the council made. The scientific consensus sat in their usual spot, looking superior and detached from everyone else, a feat considering some of them were literally gelatinous blobs. High Councillor Prell's throat sacs had now turned an interesting shade of mauve, never a good sign. Their species, the arbitrators, had been chosen to lead the council precisely because of their legendary patience. Looking at Prell now, that patience seemed to be wearing remarkably thin. The human ambassador will be arriving shortly, Prell announced, their voice cutting through the chaos like a plasma beam. I expect all representatives to maintain proper diplomatic decorum. A laugh almost escaped me. Proper diplomatic decorum? In this chamber? The last time we had proper diplomatic decorum was when half the chamber was accidentally sedated by a malfunctioning environmental system. Some say that was the most productive session in council history. The chamber's main doors began to slide open, their ancient mechanisms groaning in protest. The arguments died down to urgent whispers, then to complete silence. Even the Commerce Coalition stopped their incessant calculating. All eyes, including my three, turned toward the entrance. The human was about to arrive, and with them, perhaps the most important council session in recent history was about to begin. I adjusted my posture and checked that my translator was working correctly. This was going to be interesting, and by interesting I mean potentially catastrophic in the most entertaining way possible. The problem with humans, as any seasoned council member would tell you, is that they simply refuse to follow the script. Every other species had done the sensible thing. Upon discovering faster than light travel, they'd immediately petitioned to join the Galactic Council, submitted to our regulations, and fallen in line with the established order. But humans? They took one look at our carefully crafted guidelines and treated them like a suggestion list. Let us review the situation, High Councillor Prell announced, activating the chamber's holographic display. A timeline of human advancement appeared before us, and I had to admit, it was both impressive and terrifying. In just 50 solar cycles, they had gone from primitive chemical rockets to ships that could dance through dimensional space like quantum and ballet performers. Point of concern, Ambassador Lux of the Science Consensus raised their crystalline appendage. The humans have achieved quantum tunneling efficiency that exceeds our theoretical models by 47%. They projected a series of calculations that meant nothing to most of us, but seemed to cause several scientific representatives to emit distress pheromones. The Commerce Coalition's spokesman, a particularly rotund mercantile named Dax Profit Seeker, wobbled excitedly on their hover platform. But think of the trade possibilities. Their entertainment broadcasts alone have increased our revenue by. Silence Thix interrupted, all three mouths snarling in unison. While you count your credits, they build their fleets. Need I remind the Council of the Richardson incident? Ah, yes, the Richardson incident. I suppressed a chuckle, remembering how that particular debacle had unfolded. The Council had attempted to restrict human expansion by establishing a quarantine zone around their colony worlds. Captain Amanda Richardson, commanding a small survey vessel, had responded by broadcasting the quarantine beacon's control frequencies to every human ship in range. The entire blockade network had ended up flashing advertisements for something called space tacos for 3 standard weeks. Our attempts at containment have been ineffective, Prell admitted, their throat sacs deflating slightly. The holographic display shifted to show various failed initiatives. The technology embargo of 2789 humans simply invented better tech. The cultural integration program, now half the galaxy was obsessed with human cat videos. And the disastrous military deterrence campaign, which had somehow resulted in humans being hired as military advisors by several council races. The human ambassador approaches announced the chamber's AI, its tone somehow managing to sound nervous. The main doors began to open, and in walked Marcus Stone. Now, I had seen humans before, but Stone was different. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards and had several aces hidden up their sleeve. His diplomatic robes, rather than following the Council's suggested guidelines, seemed to be a fusion of various Earth military dress uniforms. A clear message that esteemed members of the Council. Stone's voice carried effortlessly across the chamber, not bothering to use the translation systems. Of course, he spoke perfect Galactic Standard. Humans had mastered xenolinguistics with the same casual ease they approached everything else. I bring greetings from Earth. I noticed something odd about his entrance. Protocol dictated that junior species representatives should wait to be acknowledged by at least 3 senior council members. Stone had just walked in and started talking, like someone entering their own home. The worst part? Nobody had even thought to object. Ambassador Stone Prill managed, their voice steady despite their rapidly paling throat sacs. We are discussing matters that concern humanity's place in the galactic community. Stone smiled. It was the kind of smile that reminded me why humans were classified as descended from predator species. How fascinating, he said, taking his place on the speaking platform. I have some thoughts on that matter myself. The chamber grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of prey animals realizing they were being stalked. I adjusted my recording devices, making sure to capture every moment. Whatever was about to happen, I had a feeling the Council archives would want a pristine record of it. Stone pulled out what appeared to be an ancient Earth timepiece, a watch I believe they called it, and checked it with deliberate slowness. I do hope, he said, still smiling that predator's smile, that we can reach an understanding quickly. I have a rather important appointment in about 30 minutes. Thix bristled at the casual dismissal of council procedures. You dare to rush the Grand Council. Oh no, Stone replied pleasantly. I'm just saying that in 30 minutes, certain things will happen automatically if I'm not there to stop them. But please do continue with the discussion about containing humanity. It's quite entertaining. And that's when I realized what that smile really meant. This wasn't a diplomatic session at all. This was an ambush. The Council erupted into what we generously call spirited debate, though a more accurate term might be barely controlled panic. I settled back in my observation pod, noting how the various factions were scrambling to adjust their positions now that Stone had dropped his little temporal bombshell into our proceedings. We cannot allow ourselves to be threatened by a junior species. Ambassador Thix was practically climbing out of their platform, all 3 mouths working overtime to express their outrage. The very foundations of galactic order depend on proper hierarchical respect. The Commerce Coalition representatives were having what appeared to be simultaneous nervous breakdowns, their accounting tentacles twitching as they ran calculations. Their leader, Dax Profit Seeker, had turned an interesting shade of chartreuse. But the trade implications, the monetary exchange systems, think of the quarterly projections. Stone sat there, looking for all the world like what humans call a cat that ate the canary. I never understood that phrase until this moment. He wasn't even pretending to pay attention to the chaos, instead examining his fingernails with exaggerated interest. Perhaps Ambassador Yora's melodic voice cut through the din, their bioluminescent patterns suggesting both concern and calculation. We should ask Ambassador Stone what exactly will happen in 30 minutes. Several council members nodded in agreement, while others shrank back in their pods, as if the very question might trigger whatever human scheme was in motion. High Counselor Prell raised all four hands for silence, their throat sacs now cycling through colors faster than a malfunctioning display panel. Ambassador Stone, would you care to elaborate on your statement? Oh, I couldn't possibly comment on operational details, Stone replied with that same predatory smile. Security concerns, you understand. Though I must say, Ambassador Thex, how are those new planetary defense systems working out? The ones you purchased from the merchant guilds of Proxima. I watched Thex's scales ripple in alarm. The Corax had spent a fortune on those systems, supposedly top-secret purchases that would finally give them military superiority in their sector. The fact that Stone knew about them was concerning enough. The way he asked about them was terrifying. The scientific consensus representatives huddled together, their crystalline forms clicking rapidly in their private frequency. One of them, Dr. Luminox, finally spoke up. Our analysis suggests that humanity's technological progression has exceeded all predicted models by a factor of 734%. Stone finished for them. Though your models failed to account for quantum entanglement innovations in the Europa research stations. Easy mistake to make, considering we kept those off the public networks. The chamber went so quiet you could have heard a whisperling's thoughts. The scientific consensus representatives started emanating distress patterns so intense that several nearby diplomats had to adjust their radiation shields. I noticed something that others seemed to have missed. Stone hadn't actually threatened anyone. He hadn't made any demands. He was just sharing information. Information he shouldn't have had access to. Information that made it clear that humanity knew far more about us than we knew about them. This is outrageous, a voice called from the militant bloc. We should mobilize the combined fleet immediately. Stone checked his timepiece again. 22 minutes now. Though if you're considering military action, you might want to ask the Arcturus Defense Coalition how their new cloaking technology is working out. The one they definitely haven't been developing in secret for the past 3 cycles. Another shocked silence. The Arcturus representatives looked like they wanted their pods to swallow them whole. I move for an immediate vote on sanctions against Earth, Thex demanded, their staff crackling with barely contained energy. Interesting proposal, Stone mused. Though before we vote, has anyone heard from the mining colonies in the Omega sector lately? I only ask because communications can be so unreliable out there, especially when certain parties are conducting unauthorized archaeological excavations of precursor technology. More shifting in pods. More nervous glances. I counted at least 12 different species that had gone completely still, species that, I now realized, all had interests in the Omega sector that weren't exactly public knowledge. High Counselor Prell's throat sacs had stopped changing colors entirely, settling on a pale, sickly white. Ambassador Stone, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Stone interrupted pleasantly. I'm just making conversation while we wait. 15 minutes now, by the way. You know, this reminds me of a fascinating discussion I had with some Xylaxian traders about null space storage technology. Ambassador Krax, your people's research in that area is quite impressive. Very hush-hush. Of course. I felt my scales tighten against my body. That project was buried under so many layers of security that even I only knew about it because of my diplomatic clearance. Yet Stone had tossed it into conversation like he was discussing the weather. Looking around the chamber, I saw the same realization dawning on every representative's face. Humanity hadn't just caught up to us technologically, they had surpassed us, and done so while maintaining perfect surveillance of everything we thought we were keeping secret. The Commerce Coalition pods were now hovering closer together, their occupants whispering frantically. The scientific consensus representatives had gone from distress patterns to what looked suspiciously like surrender patterns. Even the militant bloc had fallen silent. Stone stood up, straightening his uniform with deliberate care. 10 minutes. I don't mean to rush anyone, but I do believe High Counselor Prell was about to call for a recess. Just long enough for everyone to consult with their governments about humanity's place in the galactic community. Prell's throat sacs managed a weak pulse. A recess would be prudent. As the chamber began to empty, diplomats practically racing for their communication pods, I caught Stone's eye. He winked at me. Actually winked. I had to admire the sheer audacity of it all. Humanity hadn't just beaten us at our own game, they'd been playing an entirely different game all along. When the council reconvened exactly 9 minutes later, the chamber felt different. Gone was the usual pompous posturing, replaced by something I hadn't seen in 300 cycles of diplomatic service: genuine fear. Even the environmental controls seemed to be running cooler, though that might have been due to the collective cold sweat of 300 species representatives. Stone stood at the central podium, a position traditionally reserved for senior council members. Nobody objected. The human had shed his pleasant diplomatic facade, and now his expression reminded me of recordings I'd seen of Earth's apex predators, wolves. I believe they were called right before they pounced on their prey. Esteemed members of the council, Stone began, his voice carrying an edge that made several species' threat detection organs throb. I come before you today with a declaration. High Counselor Prell's throat sacs had somehow managed to find an even paler shade of white. The council recognizes Ambassador Stone, they said, their voice barely a whisper. Humanity declares war, Stone announced, pausing for effect, on stupidity. The translation systems actually stuttered, trying to process that statement. I watched as confusion rippled through the chamber, replacing fear with bewilderment. Several representatives were frantically checking their translators, convinced they must have malfunctioned. I beg your pardon, Thix managed to sputter with only one of their 3 mouths, a sign of how shocked they were. Stone's predatory smile returned, but now there was something else behind it, something that looked suspiciously like genuine amusement. Oh, you heard me correctly. Humanity is declaring war on stupidity, bureaucratic nonsense, political games, and the bizarre notion that technological progress should be stifled for the sake of maintaining an artificial hierarchy. He began to pace the podium, every movement deliberate and controlled. For 50 cycles. We've watched this council play its games. We've watched you hoard technological advances that could save lives. We've seen you maintain artificial scarcity to control member worlds. We've observed as you wrapped simple solutions in layers of bureaucracy so thick that problems remain unsolved for generations. The Commerce Coalition representatives were practically vibrating with anxiety. DAX profit seekers' accounting tentacles had tied themselves into knots. Let me be clear, Stone continued, pulling out his timepiece again. In exactly 1 minute, humanity will begin implementing what we call Project Lighthouse. We are going to start broadcasting freely and to every corner of the galaxy technological specifications for clean energy production, efficient food replication, advanced medical techniques, and yes, faster-than-light travel improvements. The chamber erupted in chaos. The scientific consensus representatives were emitting panic patterns so intense that they were actually starting to merge into one crystalline mass. The militant bloc was shouting threats that their translators were refusing to process, probably for the sake of diplomatic propriety. You cannot do this, Thix roared, their staff now crackling with enough energy to suggest they were considering something extremely undiplomatic. The economic implications alone would. Would what? Stone interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a plasma torch through butter. Would destabilize your carefully controlled markets. Would allow developing worlds to advance without becoming dependent on your trade agreements. Would make it impossible for you to maintain your artificial monopolies on basic necessities. He checked his timepiece one final time, and it's done. Project Lighthouse is now active and cannot be stopped. The encryption is based on principles your scientists haven't even theorized yet. The transmission methods use channels you can't detect, let alone block. The chamber's primary display screens suddenly blazed to life, showing thousands, no, millions of data streams being broadcast across the galaxy. I recognized technical specifications, medical procedures, engineering schematics. The sum total of human technological achievement being given away for free. This isn't war, Ambassador Yora said. They're bioluminescent patterns showing genuine wonder. This is liberation. Precisely, Stone agreed, nodding to the Celestial Concordance representative. Though I suppose it depends on where you're standing. From up here in the council chamber, it probably looks a lot like an attack. After all, we're destroying the very foundation of your power structure. The Commerce Coalition pods were now trying to leave the chamber, only to find the doors sealed. Stone smiled at their attempts. Don't worry, you're not prisoners. We just need to finish this conversation. The council will never stand for this, Thex declared, though I noticed they were clutching their staff more like a support beam than a weapon now. The council, Stone said, spreading his arms wide, is cordially invited to join us in dragging this galaxy into a new age of prosperity. Or you can stand aside and watch as every world under your control realizes they don't need your permission to advance anymore. He turned slowly, meeting the eyes of every major faction representative. Humanity isn't interested in conquering the galaxy. We don't want your territories, your resources, or your submission. We want something far more dangerous. We want everyone to have the chance to reach their full potential. High Counselor Prell's throat sacs had begun to show hints of color again, though not from anger. If I wasn't mistaken, that particular shade of blue indicated respect. And what Prell asked, their voice stronger now, does humanity want in return for this liberation? Stone's expression softened for the first time since he entered the chamber. Would you believe me if I said nothing? We're doing this because we can, and because it's right, though. And here that predatory smile returned. I wouldn't say no to a strongly worded letter of protest. We'll frame it next to all the others we've received over the years. Looking around the chamber, I could see the moment when the reality of the situation finally sank in for my fellow representatives. Humanity hadn't come to conquer us with weapons or armies. They had done something far more devastating. They had just rendered the entire galactic power structure obsolete with a single broadcast. And as I watched data streams continuing to flow across the display screens, carrying the knowledge to revolutionize countless worlds, I realized something that made me laugh out loud, drawing startled looks from nearby pods. The humans had just declared war by forcing peace on us all. As the council chambers descended into a mix of stunned silence and muffled panic, my data terminals were practically melting down with incoming information. Project Lighthouse wasn't just a simple data dump, it was the most sophisticated information distribution system I had ever seen. The humans hadn't just prepared this overnight. This had been their plan all along. Ambassador Stone, I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. How long has humanity been preparing for this moment? Stone turned to me with that infuriating smile of his. Would you believe me if I said since our first contact with the council? The pieces started falling into place in my mind. Every seemingly random human action over the past 50 cycles suddenly made perfect sense. Their casual disregard for council restrictions? They were gathering data on our enforcement capabilities. Their peculiar trade routes? Setting up distribution networks for today's broadcast. Even their notorious entertainment broadcasts had served a purpose. The cat videos I blurted out, earning confused looks from my fellow representatives. Those weren't just entertainment, were they? Stone actually laughed. Finally. Someone figured it out. Do you know how hard it is to track digital information across a galaxy? Unless, of course, you have billions of beings voluntarily sharing and rebroadcasting data packets in every corner of known space. Really, we should thank the Commerce Coalition for making our entertainment broadcasts go viral. You did half the infrastructure work for us. DAX profit seekers' accounting tentacles went completely limp. The implications of how thoroughly they'd been played were apparently too much for their profit-oriented mind to handle. But the technological advances Dr. Luminox of the scientific consensus interjected, their crystalline form vibrating with both fear and fascination. Our models suggest it should have taken centuries to achieve what you claim. Your models, Stone replied, were based on the assumption that technological progress should be careful, controlled, and most importantly, profitable. Humanity took a different approach. We threw out the rulebook, crowdsourced solutions, and embraced what we call open-source development. The data streams on the chamber's displays shifted, showing something that made several scientific consensus representatives emit distress patterns so severe that their crystalline forms began to crack. I squinted at the readings, then felt my scales ripple in shock. "That's impossible," I said. "You've achieved quantum consciousness transfer." Among other things, Stone nodded. "Turns out when you let people work together freely, without artificial restrictions or profit motives, progress happens at an exponential rate. Who knew?" High Counselor Prell's throat sacs had begun cycling through colors, so rapidly they looked like malfunctioning festival lights. The security implications, the potential for chaos, are precisely why we didn't just dump this information without preparation, Stone interrupted. Look at the data streams more carefully. Notice anything interesting about how they're structured. I did as he suggested, and felt my third eye widen in surprise. The information wasn't being broadcast randomly. It was being distributed in carefully calibrated packages, each tailored to the recipient's current technological level. Worlds that barely had space flight weren't receiving quantum physics data, they were getting the fundamentals they needed to advance sustainably. "You've created a technological uplift program," I realized aloud. "One that prevents any society from advancing faster than they can handle the responsibilities." "Give the ambassador a prize," Stone grinned. "Though I should point out that your own world, Ambassador Cracks, is receiving the complete data package. Our analysis suggests the Xylaxians are more than ready for it. You've just been held back by council restrictions." The chamber erupted again as various representatives began demanding to know what their worlds were or weren't receiving. Stone just stood there, looking more amused by the second. "But the military implications," Thex bellowed, finally finding their voice again. "You've given away your technological advantages." Stone's expression turned serious for the first time. "Have we? Did it occur to you that maybe, just maybe, what we're sharing isn't everything we have? That perhaps a species capable of preparing this level of galactic revolution might have a few more surprises tucked away?" The silence that followed that statement was deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the truth: we weren't seeing humanity's full capabilities at all. This was just what they were willing to share. "As of this moment," Stone continued, "humanity has defensive installations around every major population center in human space that could repel the combined fleets of every council species. We have monitoring systems that can detect and track any ship, cloaked or not, within 50 light years of our borders. And those are just the systems we developed as precautions, not the ones we developed for actual military use." He paused, letting that sink in. "But we're not sharing those technologies today. Because unlike this council, we understand the difference between uplifting societies and destabilizing them. The knowledge we're sharing will let every world defend itself and provide for its people. The knowledge we're keeping will ensure that anyone thinking of using these advances for conquest will have a very, very bad day." Looking around the chamber, I saw the final pieces click into place for my fellow representatives. Humanity hadn't just outmaneuvered us, they had transcended the very game we thought we were playing. While we were trying to maintain our power through restriction and control, they had built something far more powerful, a system that made such control obsolete. The Council's emergency session lasted another 6 hours, though the outcome was decided the moment Stone revealed Project Lighthouse. It's rather difficult to argue against someone who has already accomplished everything they set out to do while you were still debating whether to let them speak. The Council hereby recognizes humanity's right to share technological and scientific advances across all sectors, High Counselor Prell announced, their throat sacs finally settling on a shade of diplomatic resignation. Furthermore, we welcome their assistance in managing the transition to this new era of galactic cooperation. I had to admire the political tap dancing in that statement. We weren't surrendering to humanity, oh no, we were welcoming their assistance. Stone's barely concealed smirk suggested he appreciated the wordplay as well. The Commerce Coalition, led by a still-shaken Dax profit seeker, had already begun restructuring their entire economic model. Funny how quickly profit at all costs can become adapt or become irrelevant. The scientific consensus was practically tripping over themselves to establish research partnerships with human institutions. Even the militant bloc had grown surprisingly quiet, though I noticed techs frantically communicating with their homeworld about upgrading their defensive systems. As the chamber began to empty, Stone approached my observation pod. "Ambassador Cracks, a moment." "Come to gloat?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Actually, I came to offer you a job," he replied, catching me completely off guard. "Humanity needs representatives who understand both the old system and the new one we're building. Someone with a sense of perspective and perhaps a sense of humor about it all." I stared at him with all three eyes. "You planned this too, didn't you?" Approaching me specifically. "Let's just say we've been reading your private reports to your government. The ones where you've been suggesting for years that the Council's approach was unsustainable. The ones that kept getting ignored." He shrugged. "We recognize a kindred spirit when we see one. And if I refuse? Then you go home and continue filing reports that no one reads." But somehow he gestured at my still active data terminals displaying the Project Lighthouse streams. "I don't think you want to miss what happens next." I looked around the now empty council chamber, at the ancient halls of power that had just been rendered obsolete by a species that most of us had tried to dismiss as upstart primitives. Then I looked back at Stone, who was still wearing that insufferable smile of his. "There's one thing I don't understand," I said. "Why call it Project Lighthouse?" The smile widened. "Because its purpose is to guide ships to safe harbor and warn them of dangerous waters. Though I should mention, that's not its only name. Would you like to know what we called it internally?" I nodded, suddenly sure I was about to understand the true joke in all of this. "Project Trojan Horse," Stone said with a wink. Though in this case, the gift horse was exactly what it appeared to be. The trick was getting everyone so worried about what might be inside that they never noticed we'd already won the war before we even showed up. I couldn't help it. I laughed. I laughed harder than I had in all my 300 cycles of diplomatic service. Because in the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't their technology, their preparation, or even their strategy. Their greatest victory was making us defeat ourselves by expecting them to be as petty and power-hungry as we were. "When do I start?" I asked, still chuckling. Stone checked his timepiece one final time. "How about now?" After all, he grinned, "We have a galaxy to upgrade." As we walked out of the council chamber together, I couldn't help but think that perhaps humanity's war on stupidity wasn't such a bad thing after all. Though I did make a mental note to keep an eye on what other projects they might have ready to launch. After all, I had a feeling Project Lighthouse was just the beginning.